Good morning, brothers and sisters. So during my live stream this past week, I touched on the topic of animal sacrifices in the millennium. Somebody had a question about this, so I did a little research and more digging. I found some excellent answers from Ariel Ministries, which is Arnold Fruchtenbaum's ministry. So today I wanted to give you some answers as to why there must be animal sacrifices in the millennial kingdom. And I know a lot of people are confused about this because Christ is our ultimate sacrifice for sin. So several passages in the Hebrew Scriptures indicate that animal sacrifices will be reinstituted during the millennial kingdom, the most important one being Ezekiel chapters 44 through 46. Many evangelical and Protestant believers struggle with the return of animal sacrifices in a future temple, as they assume this would be equivalent to a denial of the finality and sufficiency of Christ's sacrifice. Dispensationalists have therefore felt compelled to answer the question of the purpose of a millennial sacrificial system, and the various options will be summarized here. In summary of Ezekiel chapters 44 through 46, we note that these chapters are concerned with the various laws regulating the system of priesthood and sacrifices during the Messianic kingdom. While there are similarities with the commandments of the law of Moses, there are also some major differences. For this reason, the millennial system of priesthood and sacrifice must not be viewed as a reinstitution of the law of Moses, which ended permanently with the death of the Messiah. A whole new system of law will be instituted for the time of his 1,000-year reign on earth. The Ezekiel passage has 7 major sections dealing with this theme. The first section, Ezekiel 44, 1 through 3, concerns the law of the outer eastern gate. The passage states that in the beginning of the millennium, the gate will be shut for the remainder of the 1,000 years. The second section, Ezekiel 44, 4 through 8, contains a message of the Shekinah glory, which points out Israel's present sins. The third section, Ezekiel 44, 9 through 14, describes the duties of the Levites, who will be the caretakers of the millennial temple. The fourth section, Ezekiel 44, 15 through 31, concerns the duties of the sons of Zadok, who will be in charge of the sacrifices of the temple. The fifth section, Ezekiel 45, 1 through 8, describes the holy oblation, or the mountain of Jehovah's house. The sixth section, Ezekiel 45, 9 through chapter 46, describes the duties of the prince David. And the seventh section, Ezekiel 46, 19 through 24, concerns the laws of the boiling of the sacrifices. So here are some of the explanations for the purpose of sacrifices in the millennium. Number 1 is the means of restoring fellowship for the millennial saint. It should be kept in mind that the Mosaic sacrifices never took away sin and were not the means of salvation for the Old Testament saint. The Old Testament saint was saved by grace through faith. The blood sacrifices were the means of restoring fellowship of a saint who had sinned. In this present age, fellowship for the believer is restored by confession, 1 John 1:9. The millennial sacrifices will not take away sin either, but they will be the means of restoring fellowship for the millennial saint who sins. Number 2, ritual cleansing for ritual uncleanliness. Since the Shekinah will reside in the Holy of Holies of the millennial temple, it will be impossible to approach the temple compound in a state of ritual impurity. Therefore, the sacrifices will be for the cleansing of ceremonial uncleanliness. It is necessary to remember 3 facts about life in the millennial kingdom. First, the presence of God will dwell literally in the midst of the people. Second, the unglorified human population will be capable of incurring ritual defilement and polluting the earthly sanctuary. Third, the millennial population will be under the new covenant and will be regarded as a holy and priestly nation, just as they, the Jews, were under the Mosaic covenant. The nation, and in the future also the nations, must maintain a status of ceremonial purity. As argued above, the kind of sacrificial atonement is not for salvation, nor for inward sanctification, but to preserve outward corporate sanctification, so that a holy God can remain in the midst of an unholy people. Since every member of this theocratic kingdom will be required to conform to the ceremonial requirements, the sacrificial system will be necessary in order to sustain corporate sanctity. Dr. Tommy Ice expresses it this way, quote, "Critics of future millennial sacrifices seem to assume that all sacrifices, past and future, always depict Christ's final sacrifice for sin. They do not. There were various purposes for sacrifices in the Bible. An overwhelming majority of sacrifices under the Mosaic system were for purification of the priests and objects used in various rites. This is why atonement can be said in the past to be effective, yet still need Christ's future sacrifice, because many of the sacrifices did atone ceremonially, cleansing participants and objects in temple ritual. Just as we never finished the task of washing clothes, ceremonial cleansing was an ongoing need. The same is clearly the case in Ezekiel. In Ezekiel 43, verse 20 and 26, the atonement is specifically directed at cleansing the altar in order to make it ritually fit for sacrifice. The only other uses of atonement also refer to cleansing objects so that ritual purity may be maintained for proper function of further worship. Since all the sacrifices of Ezekiel relate to purification of the priests for the temple service, they do not specifically depict or represent Christ's atoning sacrifice. The presence and purpose of sacrifices neither diminishes the finished work of Christ nor violates the normal and literal interpretation of these prophetic passages. Nothing in Ezekiel 40 through 48 conflicts with the death of Christ or New Testament teaching. The supposed contradictions between a literal understanding of Ezekiel and New Testament doctrine evaporate when examined specifically. The privilege of life and physical blessing in a theocratic kingdom. The relationship between the future sacrifices and Yeshua's sacrifice on the cross is characterized by a contrast. While the Old Testament sacrificial system was effective, it was not expiatory, meaning while it effected temporary ritual restoration, it did not take away the guilt of sin. While in the future kingdom salvation will be through grace by faith alone, it has always been physical blessings, and the privilege of life will depend on an outward conformity to the ceremonial law of the time. This is a view innovated by Dr. John Whitcomb. Commenting on the millennial sacrifices, he writes, "They will not be totally voluntary or purely memorial, as is true of the Christian Eucharist. Ezekiel says that God will accept people on the basis of animal sacrifices, and they are to make atonement for the house of Israel. In other words, just as in Old Testament times, the privilege of life and physical blessing in the kingdom will be contingent upon outward conformity to the ceremonial law. Such conformity did not bring salvation in Old Testament times, but saved Israelites who willingly conformed. Only faith in God could bring salvation, and this has been God's plan in every dispensation. It is a serious mistake to insist that these sacrifices be expiatory. They were certainly not expiatory in the Mosaic economy, and they will not be so in the millennium. But their symbolic value, unlike the communion service, will be upheld by a legalistic system of enforced participation. For example, those who decide to neglect the Feast of Tabernacles will be punished by a drought or a plague. If the true significance of the 5 offerings be understood, it is not difficult to see how they could serve as effective vehicles of divine instruction and discipline for Israel and the nations during the kingdom age. So in conclusion, in the Hebrew scriptures, animal sacrifices served as an object lesson, showing the gravity of sin and the necessary consequences of death. For those born in the millennial kingdom, the sacrificial system will once again remind people of what it cost the Messiah to bring salvation, since in those sacrifices there is a remembrance made of sins year by year. Furthermore, we need to remember that the foundational rationale of the sacrificial system of the Mosaic Law, which was instituted after the descent of the Shekinah glory, was the presence of God. This presence had to be protected against man's sinfulness and uncleanliness. When Yeshua resides in the millennial temple, sacrificial blood will become necessary once more in order to protect the divine from the unclean. God bless.